When an empath is hurt repeatedly, something subtle but powerful begins to change inside their internal world. At first, the empath does not become less feeling. They become more alert. Their system starts recording patterns, not just events, but emotional patterns. Tone of voice, delays in response, inconsistencies, microsignals of rejection or neglect. Internally, the brain begins shifting its priority from connection to prediction. The empath is no longer simply experiencing relationships, they are monitoring them. This is the beginning of hypervigilance. Not always visible from the outside, but constantly active inside. Over time, repeated emotional injury creates a neurological adaptation. The nervous system starts treating emotional unpredictability as danger. This is important. It is not a conscious decision. It is conditioning. The body learns that openness leads to pain, and so it begins to reduce openness automatically. One of the first internal changes is emotional filter. E.g., the empath still feels deeply, but they stop expressing everything they feel. Instead, emotions are processed internally, analyzed, and often suppressed. This creates an internal split: what is felt versus what is shown. That split is not weakness. It is protection. As this continues, the empath may develop what can be described as emotional compression. Instead of releasing emotional responses in real time, everything is stored, stacked, and delayed. This creates internal pressure. On the surface, they may appear calm or even detached, but internally, the emotional system is highly active. Another major shift occurs in trust circuitry. The brain begins to associate closeness with risk. So even when a situation is safe, the nervous system may still react as if something is wrong. This is why empaths who have been repeatedly hurt often feel on edge in peaceful situations. Their biology has not yet updated the pattern. At a deeper level, identity also begins to shift. The empath starts asking unconscious questions like, "Why does this keep happening to me?" Or "Is something wrong with how I love?" This is where self-blame can quietly enter. Not because it is true, but because the brain tries to create control out of chaos. As emotional pain continues without repair, the system may begin emotional desensitization. This is not the loss of empathy, it is the reduction of emotional availability as a defense mechanism. The empath still understands others deeply, but their internal access to warmth becomes restricted. They begin conserving emotional energy. In some cases, this leads to a paradox. The empath becomes more compassionate toward others while becoming more disconnected from themselves. This happens because external attunement remains strong, but internal safety decreases. Eventually, the nervous system builds a default protective state. This can look like overthinking, emotional withdrawal, sudden detachment, or difficulty trusting positive intent. The C are not personality changes. They are survival responses that became long-term patterns. But the most important internal truth is this: nothing about the empath's core capacity to feel is destroyed. It is layered under protection systems. The empathy is still there. The sensitivity is still there. It is simply guarded. Repeated emotional hurt changes how an empath's nervous system interprets relationships and safety in ways that are gradual, automatic, and often unnoticed at first. An empath does not typically begin by withdrawing or shutting down. They begin by noticing more. Subtle shifts in tone, delays in replies, changes in energy, inconsistencies in behavior. These details become amplified in their awareness. What once felt neutral or insignificant starts to feel meaningful, because the nervous system is trying to prevent future emotional injury by predicting it earlier. When emotional pain happens repeatedly, the brain starts updating its internal model of relationships. Instead of assuming connection is safe by default, it begins to treat connection as something that must be constantly evaluated. This is not a conscious decision. It is a survival-based recalibration. The empath's nervous system becomes more sensitive to cues that previously would have been filtered out. A neutral expression might now be interpreted as disapproval. A delayed response might be interpreted as rejection. This shift is not imagination, it is the brain prioritizing threat detection over emotional openness. As this continues, the body begins to associate emotional closeness with uncertainty. Even in calm or stable moments, the nervous system may remain slightly activated, as if waiting for something to go wrong. This creates a background state of tension. The empath may still engage, still care, still show up, but internally, there is often a parallel process running: scanning, evaluating, and preparing. Over time, this can make relationships feel mentally exhausting even when nothing overtly harmful is happening in the present moment. Repeated hurt also changes how emotional safety is defined internally. Instead of safety being linked to trust and consistency, safety starts to become linked to distance and control. If closeness previously led to pain, the nervous system learns that emotional distance reduces risk. So the empath may begin to unconsciously create space not because they want disconnection, but because their system is trying to regulate overwhelming emotional input. This can look like withdrawal, emotional restraint, or selective engagement. At the same time, emotional processing itself begins to shift. Feelings are still strong, but they are no longer freely expressed. The empath starts to internalize emotional responses, holding them in rather than releasing them outward. This creates a build-up effect. Instead of experiencing emotion in a flowing way, emotions become layered and stored. The system becomes more efficient at suppressing expression, but less efficient at releasing tension. The most important change is that trust becomes conditional rather than automatic. The empath no longer gives trust based on potential. They begin to require repeated evidence of safety before relaxing. Even then, relaxation is partial, because the nervous system remembers previous injuries more strongly than current comfort. This is why someone can feel safe in a moment but still not feel fully secure overall. Eventually, this creates a dual experience: outward engagement with relationships and inward vigilance within them. The empath may appear present, even warm, but internally they are partially guarded. This is not emotional failure. It is adaptive learning. The nervous system is doing exactly what it is designed to do: protect against repeated harm by adjusting perception. Over time, this altered interpretation of relationships becomes the new baseline. But it is not permanent identity. It is conditioned perception shaped by experience. And because it is learned through experience, it can also be reshaped through new patterns of safety, consistency, and emotional repair. The brain begins to shift from openness to hypervigilance as a survival mechanism when emotional experiences repeatedly signal unpredictability, rejection, or harm. In the beginning, the mind is naturally oriented toward openness. It expects connection to be safe, rewarding, and stabilizing. In that state, attention is relaxed. The nervous system is regulated, meaning it does not need to constantly scan for danger. Emotional energy is directed outward toward understanding, bonding, and engagement. However, when emotional hurt becomes repetitive, the brain starts to revise its assumptions. It does not do this philosophically or consciously, it does it biologically. The limbic system, particularly regions involved in threat detection, begins to assign greater importance to emotional cues that might indicate future pain. This is the foundation of hypervigilance. The brain is not trying to create anxiety, it is trying to create prediction accuracy. It is attempting to reduce uncertainty by increasing awareness. As this adaptation strengthens, the focus of attention subtly changes. Instead of fully experiencing the present moment in a relational interaction, part of the mind begins to monitor the interaction. It tracks tone, facial expression, timing, energy shifts, and behavioral inconsistencies. This split attention is the beginning of internal vigilance. On the surface, the person may still appear engaged, but internally, there is a second layer of processing running continuously in the background. Over time, the threshold for what is considered important data becomes lower. Signals that were once ignored or processed as neutral are now flagged for interpretation. A slight pause in communication might be evaluated as emotional withdrawal. A change in tone might be analyzed for hidden meaning. The brain is essentially ending its threat detection network, not because danger is always present, but because it is trying to avoid being caught off guard again. This shift also changes how emotional safety is experienced. In a regulated state, safety feels like relaxation and presence. In a hypervigilant state, safety feels temporary and conditional. Even during calm interactions, the nervous system may not fully downregulate. It stays partially activated, as if preparing for a sudden change. This is why individuals in this state often describe feeling on edge even in situations that are objectively fine. Their internal system is responding not to the current moment alone, but to accumulated memory of past emotional disruption. Another important aspect of this shift is the redistribution of cognitive resources. When hypervigilance increases, more mental energy is allocated to scanning and prediction. This means less energy is available for spontaneity, emotional flow, or deep relaxation. The brain is effectively multitasking between experiencing and protecting. Over time, this can create fatigue, because constant monitoring is metabolically and emotionally expensive. Importantly, hypervigilance is not a malfunction. It is an adaptive mechanism that becomes overactive. It originally develops as a protective strategy and attempt to detect emotional danger earlier to reduce future pain. The problem is not its existence, but its persistence after the environment changes or when it becomes unnecessary in safe contexts. As this mechanism becomes more habitual, the brain begins to treat uncertainty itself as a signal. Not actual harm, but the possibility of harm becomes enough to activate the system. This is where emotional anticipation replaces emotional presence. The individual is no longer fully inside the interaction, they are partially inside the prediction of what the interaction might become. Despite all of this, the system is not fixed. Hypervigilance is learned neural conditioning, and anything learned through repetition and experience can also be reshaped through consistent safety, corrective emotional experiences, and environments that do not reinforce threat patterns. The brain does not permanently abandon openness, it temporarily prioritizes protection when it believes protection is necessary. Emotional empathy can become emotionally selective or shut down to prevent overload when the system has been exposed to repeated emotional intensity without adequate recovery. Empathy, in its natural state, is open and responsive. It allows a person to feel and understand the emotional states of others with clarity and immediacy. But when that capacity is repeatedly activated in environments where emotional input is overwhelming, inconsistent, or painful, the nervous system begins to adjust its sensitivity as a protective response. At first, this does not look like shutdown. It looks like subtle filtering. The person still understands emotions in others, but they beg in to respond less automatically. There is a brief internal pause before emotional engagement. The brain starts asking, often unconsciously, whether it is safe or necessary to fully enter another person's emotional state. This is the beginning of emotional selectivity. The system is no longer operating on full openness, it is beginning to conserve emotional bandwidth. As emotional experiences accumulate, especially those involving confusion, manipulation, or repeated hurt, the empathic system starts to recognize emotional engagement itself as a potential cost. Every time empathy is activated, there is an energetic exchange. When that exchange consistently results in depletion rather than mutual balance, the nervous system begins to prioritize protection over connection. This is not a moral decision. It is a regulatory adaptation designed to prevent exhaustion. Over time, emotional empathy can become more context-dependent. The person may still feel deeply for certain individuals or in certain situations, while feeling noticeably detached in others. This selectivity is not random, it is based on perceived emotional safety. The brain begins to categorize emotional environments: safe, uncertain, or draining. In safe environments, empathy flows naturally. In uncertain or draining environments, empathy becomes restricted or partially shut down. This shutdown is often misunderstood as coldness or emotional distance, but internally it is more accurately a form of conservation. The system is not losing the ability to feel, it is limiting access to feeling in order to maintain stability. Just like a system reduces power usage when resources are low, emotional empathy reduces output when overload has been reached. The goal is not disconnection, it is survival through regulation. In more advanced stages of this adaptation, emotional responses may become delayed or muted. The empath may intellectually understand what someone is feeling, but the emotional resonance that typically accompanies that understanding becomes weaker. This creates a gap between cognition and emotion. The mind recognizes the situation, but the body does not fully engage with it. This split is often confusing for the individual, because they remember a time when empathy was automatic and immersive. Another layer of this process involves emotional boundaries forming without conscious intent. The nervous system begins to limit how much emotional input is absorbed in real time. Instead of fully internalizing another person's emotional state, the empath may unconsciously keep part of themselves detached. This creates a buffer zone. Within that buffer, emotional intensity is reduced before it reaches full internal impact. It is important to understand that this selective shutdown is not a loss of empathy. It is a recalibration of access. The capacity remains intact, but its availability becomes regulated. In environments that consistently demonstrate safety, consistency, and emotional reciprocity, empathy often returns to a more open state. In environments that continue to produce overload, the protective restriction remains active. Ultimately, emotional empathy is not a fixed trait operating at one constant level. It is a dynamic system that responds to experience. When it is nurtured, it expands. When it is overwhelmed repeatedly, it contracts. This contraction is not the end of empathy, it is the nervous system's attempt to preserve it by limiting exposure until safety and balance are restored. Trauma loops create internal conflict between compassion and self-protection when the nervous system becomes conditioned by repeated emotional experiences that are both meaningful and harmful at the same time. A trauma loop is not just a memory of pain, it is a repeated cycle where emotional attachment and emotional injury become linked. For an empath, this creates a particularly intense internal contradiction because their natural orientation is toward understanding, section, and emotional presence. On one side of this internal system is compassion. Compassion is the part that wants to understand, forgive, stay open, and maintain emotional connection. It is driven by empathy, attachment, and a deep sensitivity to the emotional states of others. This part of the system remembers the positive moments, the potential in people, and the meaning of connection. It tends to focus on what could be restored rather than what has been damaged. On the other side is self-protection. This is the survival-based part of the nervous system that records emotional pain and tries to prevent it from happening again. It is not emotional, it is protective. It learns through repetition, and it becomes more active each time emotional injury follows closeness. Its primary goal is stability, even if that stability requires distance, detachment, or emotional withdrawal. When trauma loops are formed, these two systems begin to activate at the same time. The empath may feel DA/EP care and understanding towards someone while simultaneously feeling internal resistance, tension, or emotional warning signals. This creates a split experience. One part of the mind says, stay open, while another part says, this is not safe. Both signals feel valid because both are based on real emotional data collected over time. This conflict is not a simple emotional disagreement. It is a layered neurological process. The compassionate system is linked to attachment and meaning, while the protective system is linked to threat detection and memory. When both systems are triggered by the same person or relationship, the result is internal tension. The individual may find themselves oscillating between emotional closeness and sudden withdrawal, not because of inconsistency in personality, but because of competing internal instructions. Over time, this loop can become exhausting. Each time compassion leads to reconnection, and reconnection leads to pain, the protective system starts. NG then's its response. It begins to activate earlier and more intensely. At the same time, compassion does not disappear, it continues to recognize emotional potential and connection. This creates a repeated cycle where the empath feels pulled forward by emotional understanding and pulled backward by emotional memory. This internal conflict can also create confusion in decision-making. The empath may intellectually understand that distance is necessary, but emotionally feel drawn back into connection. Alternatively, they may feel safe in the moment but later experience emotional regret or internal alarm. This is because different parts of the nervous system process time differently. Compassion responds to present emotional cues, while protection responds to accumulated history. As trauma loops continue, the nervous system may begin to prioritize protection more frequently, not because compassion is weak, but because repetition strengthens defensive learning. However, the compassionate system does not shut down completely. Instead, it becomes more selective, cautious, and delayed in activation. The individual still cares deeply, but the expression of that care becomes regulated by internal safety checks. This creates a lived experience where empathy and boundaries are constantly negotiating. The person is not simply open or closed, they are in a continuous internal balancing act between connection and safety. This can feel like emotional whiplash, especially when the external relationship remains unpredictable. Ultimately, trauma loops do not remove compassion, they complicate its expression. They force the nervous system to hold two truths at once. That connection is meaningful, and that connection has also been a source of harm. Healing begins when the system learns that compassion does not require self-abandonment, and that self-protection does not require emotional shutdown. The nervous system may normalize emotional pain as expected behavior in relationships, IPS, when it has been exposed to repeated patterns of inconsistency, neglect, or emotional injury without sufficient repair. Over time, the brain does not just remember isolated painful events, it begins to recognize patterns and build expectations around them. If emotional pain repeatedly follows closeness, attention, or attachment, the nervous system starts to treat that sequence as familiar, and what becomes familiar is often interpreted as what is normal. This process is gradual and largely unconscious. At first, emotional pain still feels disruptive. It creates confusion, questioning, and internal resistance. But when the cycle repeats often enough, the intensity of surprise begins to fade. The brain starts to reduce its alarm response not because the situation is safe, but because it is predictable. Predictability, even in harmful environments, can feel less threatening to the nervous system than uncertainty. For an empath or emotionally sensitive individual, this adaptation can be especially subtle. Their natural baseline is emotional attunement, meaning they are highly aware of relational shifts. However, when those shifts consistently include emotional discomfort, withdrawal, or inconsistency, the nervous system begins to integrate that pattern into its relational model. Emotional pain stops being processed as an exception and slowly becomes part of the expected emotional landscape. Once this normalization begins, the brain adjusts its baseline for what relationship feels like. Instead of associating relationships primarily with safety, support, or consistency, it begins to associate them with a mix of connection and discomfort. The nervous system learns to anticipate both presence and absence, warmth and withdrawal, clarity and confusion. Over time, this duality becomes embedded in emotional expectations. This shift also affects emotional interpretation. When pain is normalized, the brain becomes less likely to flag it as a signal that something is wrong, NG. Instead, it may interpret it as part of the natural rhythm of connection. For example, emotional distance might be rationalized as normal fluctuation rather than a sign of instability. Inconsistent behavior may be reframed internally as something to adapt to rather than something to question. As this pattern strengthens, emotional tolerance increases, but not in a healthy way. It is not resilience built on stability, it is adaptation built on repetition. The nervous system becomes more capable of enduring discomfort without immediate reaction. While this may appear as emotional strength from the outside, internally it is often a form of recalibration where lower standards of emotional safety are gradually accepted as baseline. Another important effect of this normalization is the reduction of emotional contrast. When relationships include both care and pain repeatedly, the distinction between safe and unsafe emotional experiences begins to blur. The nervous system struggles to connect, categorize what should feel concerning versus what should feel acceptable. This creates a state where emotional discomfort no longer triggers immediate protective responses, because it has been integrated into the expected range of experience. This does not mean the individual no longer feels pain. It means the meaning of that pain changes. Instead of being interpreted as a signal for change or boundary setting, it may be interpreted as something to endure or manage internally. Over time, this can lead to emotional endurance replacing emotional discernment, where staying in the dynamic becomes more familiar than leaving it. At a deeper level, the nervous system prioritizes familiarity because familiarity reduces cognitive load. Even if the emotional environment is painful, if it is predictable, the brain can conserve energy by not constantly reassessing danger. This is why normalized emotional pain can feel strangely stable. It is not safe, but it is known. However, this denormalization is not permanent. It is a conditioned adaptation formed through repeated experience. When the nervous system is consistently exposed to emotionally safe, stable, and respectful interactions, it begins to recalibrate its baseline again. Emotional safety can slowly become familiar, just as emotional pain once did. The system is always updating based on what it experiences most often, even if those updates happen slowly and quietly over time. Healing begins when awareness interrupts automatic protective responses and restores boundaries, because what was once a survival-based system can only change when it is no longer operating purely on autopilot. Protective responses are not random, they are learned patterns built by repetition. The nervous system, after repeated emotional experiences, begins to react before thinking. It predicts outcomes based on past data, not present reality. So healing cannot start until something in that loop introduces awareness strong enough to create a pause between trigger and reaction. That pause is the turning point. In a dysregulated system, emotional triggers immediately activate protective behaviors: withdrawal, overthinking, emotional shutdown, appeasing, or hyperanalysis. These responses feel automatic because they are deeply conditioned, but when awareness enters the process, even briefly, it creates space. In that space, the individual is no longer fully inside the reaction. They begin to observe it instead of becoming it. This shift may feel subtle at first. It is not dramatic or emotional, it is perceptual. A person might notice, "I am withdrawing right now," instead of simply withdrawing. Or they might recognize, "This feeling is familiar, but it is not necessarily true in this moment." That recognition interrupts the automatic chain reaction that normally follows emotional activation. And when the chain is interrupted repeatedly, the nervous system begins to update its patterns. Restoring boundaries is the second critical part of healing, because boundaries are what redefine emotional safety for the system. When boundaries are weak or inconsistent, the nervous system receives mixed signals about what is acceptable and what is harmful. Over time, this confusion reinforces hypervigilance and emotional overextension. The system does not know where self ends and where others begin, so it overcompensates by either absorbing too much or shutting down completely. When boundaries are introduced with clarity, the internal system begins to reorganize. A boundary is not just a behavioral limit, it is a neurological signal that says, "This is where I stop absorbing emotional impact." Each time a boundary is held, the brain receives new data. Emotional safety does not require self-abandonment. This slowly contradicts the earlier learning that connection must come at the cost of emotional depletion. Awareness and boundaries work together. Awareness allows recognition of the automatic response. Boundaries provide the alternative action. Without awareness, boundaries cannot be enforced consistently because the person reacts before they can choose. Without boundaries, awareness remains passive insight without structural change. But when both are present, the system begins to rewire. As this process continues, the nervous system starts to loosen its protective intensity. It learns that not every emotional cue requires defense. Not every moment of discomfort is a threat. This does not happen because the environment suddenly becomes perfect, but because the internal response becomes more accurate. The system begins to distinguish between real danger and old emotional memory being replayed in new situations. Over time, the protective mechanisms that once dominated perception begin to step back. They are not eliminated, they are recalibrated. Hypervigilance reduces when it is no longer constantly reinforced. Emotional shutdown becomes less necessary when boundaries prevent overload, and reactivity decreases when awareness consistently interrupts automatic escalation. Healing, in this sense, is not the removal of sensitivity or protection. It is the restoration of choice. The individual is no longer fully controlled by past conditioning. They can feel activation without immediately becoming the reaction. They can sense discomfort without abandoning themselves or overextending. This is the beginning of emotional regulation that is based not on survival, but on conscious awareness. Ultimately, healing begins when the nervous system is repeatedly shown, through lived experience, that it does not need to rely solely on old protective patterns. Awareness creates interruption. Boundaries create structure. And together they allow the system to learn a new way of responding, one where safety is not assumed blindly, but built deliberately and consistently over time.